Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here in cyberspace with Professor Spiro Polalis. Today, we'll be talking about how cities can actually be designed better to deal with situations like the pandemic, something that we haven't really perhaps seen before. First of all, welcome, Dr. Spiro Polalis. How are you doing?
Thank you very much, Atik. Very nice, and I'm very glad to see you after we met in person a year and a half in Lahore as part of the LLF 2019.
It's great to see you again as well. I wanted to share, Dr. Polalis, a bit of an overview of what I think is happening right now, just to sort of bring all the different people who are listening in up to speed with what we'll be discussing. So I'll just share my screen. So the coronavirus has actually brought about a completely new situation, something that we've not seen before. But a lot of people feel that this is a part of a broader pattern, something that recurs every 100 years or so. And this we can see going back till about the Great Plague, starting from the 17th century, going down to the 13th. But cities, as far as we've been building them since the dawn of time, have been designed to bring people together. They've been designed as places where we meet, socialize, exchange, our daily lives happen in these spaces. But the pandemic, I mean, as you can see from this picture from Makkah, that it brought about a completely new moment. We just have to now stop and rethink exactly what our cities are going to look like if this is going to happen on a 100 sort of year pattern. These are further images from different parts of the world. But also a silver lining perhaps from all of this was that pollution levels just miraculously just came down. And looking at, in particular, Pakistan, the pre-lockdown situation, the lockdown and the post-lockdown situation, we can see a very stark difference. Then when we actually move forward to how cities have been growing around the world, and Pakistan, of course, is no exception. We've been following a pattern where cities have been growing following a car-based model. The images over here actually show urban expansion from in a 2-decade cycle. Cities now, I mean, Islamabad, for instance, once celebrated as this pristine sort of planned metropolis, very often in places can look like this. Karachi has grown to great lengths. Lahore is now looking at doing these kinds of projects that house millions and millions of people, but eventually may perhaps be unsustainable. If we're going to be working with cities, we have to realize that cities are a part of a much larger Earth system. We may think that we are actually building and we inhabit static landscapes, but those static landscapes, quote unquote, are actually subject to larger forces of change. And the landscape, for instance, in which we set any city or build any civilization is, of course, not stable. We've seen this with Mohenjo-daro, we've seen this with the Mayans, we've seen this in other parts of the world. In Pakistan, what we've seen is that in the northern areas, we have the highest concentration of glaciers outside the polar regions, which is fantastic. But given the kind of urban growth that we've decided to pursue and its impact, for example, on the heat emission, we can see in the 20-year cycle shown here that the ice cover has drastically been reduced. Then similarly, when we look at the surface temperatures of Gujranwala, Lahore and Faistabad, pre, mid and post lockdown, we see a similar situation of heat emission actually coming drastically down. This is a zoomed up version of that, showing essentially a 20-year kind of heat emission cycle. Reduction of ice cover again in the northern areas, which is resulting in a lot of destabilization in the Hunza, Skardu valleys, where we're seeing disasters like the Atabad event. We're seeing events take place, climate-based events such as...
Atik, I'm sorry, I need to interrupt you. Can you
Yes,
click
please.
to present your presentation, because we see only very small images?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry for saying this, because...
No, I'm really glad. I'm sorry. Let me, does that help? Hello?
Not yet.
Not yet. Well, let me just quickly then move on to you, Dr. Pulalis, and just ask you that what sort of cities should we be building? I mean, we've got, on the one hand, larger sort of matrix of Earth systems that we don't fully understand. We've got diminishing resources like oil, which at the current consumption rates might run out in 43 years. What sort of cities should we be actually investing in?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me today with LLF Online. The important thing, and I'm going to show some slides on that, is that we have a growing population, and the ecosystem is not able to support it unless we build in a sustainable way. And sustainable way, we can define it very explicitly what we mean. And also our cities must be resilient. And the resilience is not only resilience to flooding or earthquakes, that they are the most common until now, but also resilient in terms of the pandemics. And it looks like that this pandemic is going to stay with us for a while, but more than that, we expect to see more in the future. Scientists were expecting this. So it's not something that catches by surprise. So the question for you and me as architects, as planners, is how should we address the problems in planning, in design, for the long term? Because definitely today it is up to the doctors and the scientists to try to find out the vaccinations and the curing methods, but we can contribute by making the right cities, the right buildings, so the next pandemic is going to find us more prepared.
Quite right. But isn't it very contrary to the very purpose of cities to be able to design spaces where people can isolate themselves and shield themselves from other people? Whereas the entire sort of thrust to date has been to create dynamic public spaces where people of all types and colors can actually meet and socialize.
You're right. We have a big, actually, dichotomy here. And we should not build cities that they isolate us. But at the same time, we should build cities so that if it is necessary to isolate, they're designed in such a way to isolate in a more effective way, an efficient way, and at the same time to allow us to have the quality of life that we would like to have. But you're right, we should not go to extremes because of what is happening. We should think very carefully, and we should look at the basic activities that we have, which is where we live, where we work, where we play, where we worship.
So how would you suggest a reconfiguration of these spaces at an urban level? I mean, Paris, for instance, decided in the 19th century to create these green corridors that allowed different sections to be isolated, as it were. Is that the most...
Well, we have to look at the base of it. Actually, I have some slides. I don't know if I should show the slides or if we could continue to talk.
Perhaps we should go to the slides.
Okay, very good. So let me go to the slides, and I will try to actually share a particular screen. And probably you see my screen right now. Is that correct?
That is right.
Yes, and I started with the announcement of what we do today. So let me project and simply talk about the urban challenges. So a picture is worth 1,000 words. And this is Lahore, your city.
Quite right.
Yes, one of the cities that I really love, but you can see how it is. And you can imagine what happens if we have a pandemic, but also you can imagine that a city like this is not sustainable.
No.
And we need to do something about it. So if we look at the numbers, Pakistan increases the population very rapidly. The population in Pakistan has increased by almost 80 million people in the last 2 decades. So we're talking about more and more people. And if we look at the cities of Pakistan, I have prepared some slides here to show where they are. And the diameter of the circles shows the actually the population. We see the two mega cities, Karachi and Lahore. And we found out through a research that we're doing that about 100 cities have population of more than 100,000 people. Now, if you multiply 100 by 100, then you realize immediately how many people live in cities compared to the population of Pakistan. The next thing is that we see the cities are increasing very fast in population. And on the top part of the graph, we see how they increase in the provinces. By the way, I find out that it is not fair to talk about Pakistan, but we should talk about the provinces of Pakistan as well, because they have their own characteristics. And on the lower, yes, and the lower part, you see the different cities, the big ones. And then if we proceed, then we see that the cities are not equally distributed. We see that Punjab has almost 60% of the large cities, Sindh has 22%, and the other provinces have even less. Right. But if we proceed, this is really an amazing slide. How many people from each province live at the largest city of the province? And we see that 60% of the people of Sindh live in Karachi. Wow. It's not true about Punjab. Punjab, Lahore is only 28%, if we can say it only. But we see the urbanization here and what it means. And these mega cities are really big. Now, if we proceed here, I change now and I look at the United Nations. The United Nations have developed their sustainability development goals, and number 11, SDG 11, is about sustainable cities and communities. I would say that all of them are related to cities, but this is so explicit, and they give us information on how to approach sustainability. Now, I think we need to define a few things, because only if we define things, we can be more precise with what we do. In our research group at Harvard, we define sustainability. We use this definition of sustainability, that we want to improve the quality of human life while living within the carrying capacity of the supporting ecosystems. Now, what does that mean is that our objective is to improve the quality of human life. Our objective is not to preserve the environment. Our objective is not to look for other things. However, the important thing is within the carrying capacity. And this is not what is happening. Especially rich countries, they exceed the support of their ecosystems and they live at the expense of developing countries. Now, let's continue on resilience. Resilience is a totally different thing. It is the ability of a system, and here I look at two systems, social and ecological. I should say socioeconomic and ecological, and it is the ability to withstand stresses and also recover after shocks. What is the relationship between the two? We define that all sustainable projects must be resilient. However, a resilient project is not necessarily sustainable. We can build something that really protects us from shocks and stresses, but is not within the capacity of the ecosystem. Your question about how to build cities to face the pandemic goes exactly on this. We need to face the pandemic with a sustainable city, not just by putting big walls around us. And finally, everybody talks about climate change. Climate change is related to decarbonization, and in environmental terms, sustainability is more than decarbonization. But sustainability also addresses socioeconomic issues as well. Now, if I go to my next slide here, I say that COVID-19 is a shock to the social system. So it comes to this, and we should be resilient to this particular shock, which means that we should be in a position to withstand it and recover after the shock.
Well, Professor Polalis, would you say that our cities have shown a certain amount of resilience to the pandemic as?
Not really. In other words, I believe that our cities today did not provide us this resilience. And a great example is New York. How New York, which is probably one of the most vibrant cities of the world, how it fell the victim of COVID-19 simply because it was not designed for that.
But then on the other hand, we have cities like Hong Kong that have a similar sort of an urban fabric, a similar kind of a density. But at the same time, we're able to manage the pandemic far better. Would that perhaps be attributable to social sort of practices rather than the built environment?
Absolutely correct. And actually, Hong Kong gives us an example that during the SARS epidemic, we saw that the SARS was being actually proliferated through the sewage system of large buildings and through the air systems of large buildings. So in Hong Kong, I believe it was more of a social government response.
I see. Well, Professor Polalis, if you'd like to continue with the slides, otherwise I do have lots of questions.
Let me try to be a little brief here. So on sustainable cities, and again, always think about Pakistan. What we need to do is we need to have an integrated approach and bring together the different systems. We have to balance human life and the carrying capacity of the environment, and we have to plan for the long term. And when I talk about sustainability, I look about 5 different areas. Quality of life, which means to enhance health and quality of life, to optimal use materials, energy, and water, the resources on the ecosystem, to preserve and enhance the ecological systems. Despite of doing the cities, we have to bring them up and actually preserve them. Then we have to address long-term climate change and increase resilience to the climate change. And finally, and very important, the governance. The governance at all levels, at planning, maintenance, and monitoring. Now, if I proceed on this, I would like to say that these 5 areas apply to urban planning, infrastructure systems, and buildings.
Quite right.
And
they're applicable at every scale of the city.
Correct. At the different levels of the city. And we have to look at the buildings, and you as an architect, you appreciate that, because the buildings are components of the infrastructure. So we have to start looking at the buildings as users, but producers of energy, users and producers actually recycling water, users and distributors of food in the terms of combusting and making food for plants and so on, and also as the points where the transportation starts and ends, where people leave in the morning to go to the office, the other building is the office. And of course, all this give us ideas on how to design buildings, but also how to design the infrastructure to be compatible with the buildings.
Quite right.
And let's look at this, actually, a cyclic economy. The way we do cities right now, we import everything and we export whatever we don't want. We have to start thinking about cities that they recycle, they reuse, and they release very little outside of their boundaries, either the hinterland or the air. This is a good slide to remember, and it is feasible to do. But again, the way that we saw the Lahore in the first slide, this is not possible to be done.
Why do you say it's not a possibility in the case of Lahore?
No, I mean the way we saw the slide of Lahore. However, Lahore is expanding. You have many opportunities to do these things. And let me go a little faster here and tell you that the way we design buildings today, cities today, is that we depend on the car. And again, you remember we identified the different areas like live, play, workshop, and we go always with car, while a mixed-use, pedestrian-friendly way to move in the cities is going to make a huge difference. And again, we keep talking about sustainability. We have not addressed the pandemic yet. So at Harvard, we have developed a program, the Zofnas program, and we started more than 10 years ago, 12 years ago, and we have developed different tools for the sustainability of cities. And we have produced two tools. One is Envision for the sustainable infrastructure projects, and the other are the planning guidelines for the cities. What is interesting is that we have combined the planning of the cities with something which is very familiar in Pakistan, which is the acoustics theory by Doxiadis, who designed not only Islamabad, that we see here on the right photograph, but also Koranji, despite its eventual failure. And the acoustics theory together with the planning guidelines gives us very good information. Now, let me go quickly, and I'm going to use an example. I had the opportunity to plan a city in Pakistan. And this is the DHA city, or DCK as we call it, DHA city Karachi, planned for 100,000 people at 44 square kilometers in between Karachi and Hyderabad. I want to bring this up because if we look at the master plan, which is what we see here, what do we see and what we did? Following the example of Islamabad, we developed it based on sectors and subsectors and neighborhoods. So it is like a city within, cities within a city. This was done primarily to facilitate pedestrians, to facilitate a way of life that it is within the sector, within the neighborhood, within the subsector, so people do not have to use their car all the time. However, this particular planning is ideal for the pandemic because if there are some incidents in a subsector, you don't need to isolate the entire city. You can intervene on the subsector, or you can intervene at the sector level, and by breaking down the level of the city, then you can be more effective. Furthermore, it has a lot of open space, although we were driven by the regulations, the bylaws, and it's not as much open space as I would like it to be, but open space is extremely important for cases like the pandemic. If we proceed here, this shows the local scale, the city scale, and what you have within your proximity. And then you see how far it is to walk, how far it is if you decide to take the car, and what we have in every one of the sectors and subsectors. This is not anything new other than ekistics, what Doxiadis said. However, today we have computers, and with computers we can be much more efficient and effective in planning all those things.
Mm-hmm.
Let me go to the last slide, which is that one of the problems that I had at the DCK was that the client wanted single-family housing. Single-family housing is not sustainable. And we believe that the architects like you and me, we should start looking at alternatives. Here we see a concept of an eco-block, not very high, very human scale, but a lot of green space, and we can increase the density and at the same time leaving open space, and at the same time make sure that we do not have integrated systems, central systems for air conditioning, and we have to be very careful how we plan the sewage, so in case of a virus does not go just everywhere. So I know that I could talk forever about all these things, but I would like to stop here and say that these are some ideas that can give us the opportunity to talk a little more.
Well, thank you for the presentation, Professor Palalis. That's firstly great to know that DHA City in, well, just outside Karachi is going to be based on the model of ekistics, and in particular factor in sustainability. Is it possible, in your opinion, to retrofit existing environments to work in a more sustainable way?
Absolutely, yes. We can retrofit. But before even we retrofit, as you know, Pakistani cities are expanding. So quite rapidly. So if we focus on the expansions at this point, and then go back to the existing fabric and intervene there, I can tell you what I have proposed in Greece. As you know, I'm from Greece. In Greece, I have proposed simply to demolish buildings in certain areas and create open space, and at the same time use the area below the open space for parking and above for playgrounds and for places for people to gather. Demolishing those buildings, at least in the Greek environment, it's not difficult because there is an oversupply, which is not in Pakistan. And at the same time, the cost is low and it can be financed from the new developments.
I see.
Of course, in Pakistan, you have such a huge need for shelter that I don't believe this model could apply to you. But if we start on the expansion of the cities and then slowly we start going back, I think we're going to be very effective.
I see. In terms of Pakistani cities, there is, the reliance that we have on cars. Public transport systems don't seem to be actually giving people the right sort of culture where they feel safe or they feel that it's reliable enough to commute on a daily basis. Very often you have to use other sources like a rickshaw or a motorcycle ride to get to the public transport point and then actually, use the transit corridor itself. How do we actually create a culture where sustainability is prioritized by everyone from the developer down to the user?
This is a very complicated question, and does not have an easy answer, because people are used to a certain way of life and there is inertia. So people don't want to change their way of life. Furthermore, I would go and say that the climate, let's say Karachi, in Karachi it's very hot, it's humid.
Absolutely.
So it's very difficult to say to people, you're going to walk or you're going to use bicycles. Security is a major problem. So we have to look at an integral approach to all those problems. But definitely the first step would be to have public transportation, that it is reliable, in good shape, and it's funded and operated accordingly. So we need to have, actually, I know about the Daewoo buses in Karachi, the Korean firm Daewoo, and they call Daewoo actually the luxurious buses. I think we need to have more luxurious buses at a certain cost, yes.
So, you mentioned, Dr. Pulalis, that, for instance, we don't have the right climate in a city like Karachi. But I do believe that fundamentally, if we re-engineer the streets themselves, because we have seen during the colonial era a far more insightful understanding of the climate than what we're showing currently. The manner in which streets would be planned with trees and sort of unpaved ground, that in itself was very low heat emitting. Then buildings that had very deep arcades and verandas and balconies running all the stories above as well as on the ground. Is it possible, even if a developer shows the way, that it can be profitable to actually build in a sustainable way with a lower sort of imposition on the environment? I hope that, yeah.
Yes, actually, we are both academics as well. So I don't want people to say that we're talking about the utopian approaches that cannot be done. Nevertheless, we have to see that at that time we had much fewer people. So the growth of population requires new approaches. And no matter how many roads we have, eventually it's not going to be enough. So we have to rethink. And what we need is governance. As you noticed, one of the areas of sustainability that I stress is the area of governance, leadership. So we have to look at the policy point of view that goes hand in hand with the planning and design of the built environment. But the answer is yes, but we cannot replicate the past. We have to think of new ways of applying the same principles.
Absolutely. Would you say that our understanding of how climate works and how architecture responds to it has gotten better with time, or have we kind of taken a detour via technology and gone off track?
We have gone off track. We're based on technology more than we should. I have carried a research project, a big research project at Harvard, on the cities on the Gulf, the Arab Gulf or the Persian Gulf. And we realized and we studied how sustainable were the cities in the past, before the discovery of gas and oil. Now we depend so much on air conditioning and cars that when I'm in Doha, for example, and I want to walk 100 meters to go from one building to another, I take a taxi and the taxi drives for about 3 kilometers to go 100 meters. And of course, this is a result of not having any shelter, being very hot and humid. And nobody has thought, in addition to the very fancy buildings, to make nice pedestrian ways. But answering your question, yes, it is possible, but requires significant effort.
And that effort from the part of the people, what would that require? I mean, does it mean that if I get a crazy electricity bill, that all of a sudden now I'm considering solar electricity? Or how do we manage to actually convince people to choose a more difficult, perhaps, way, or an inconvenient way?
What happens is that people are very much caring for themselves. In other words, if you say to people that by being sustainable, you're going to save the world and the other countries, most likely they say, why should I? Why don't the others do it first? So a big electricity bill, I don't believe it's a good thing to do because people are going to revolt. What I find, yes, what I find to be very effective is education, and especially for very young children. If the school teachers, they start talking to the children and the children go home and they talk to their parents, that's a very good way to infiltrate. But also education overall, and also demonstrate that this is the right thing to do.
I was working in the Hunza Valley about 20 years ago. And we did an exercise. I was with some colleagues, and we did an exercise with school children over there. And we asked them, well, would you build a house from concrete blocks, or would you build it from mud and stone? And a lot of them opted for concrete. And then, of course, we were sitting down with them and we were like, why would you build a concrete house? And it's very funny how socially determined needs, other factors than what we have on hand, the materials that are easy to use, techniques that have resulted in a certain type of vernacular architecture in X or Y location. It's interesting how socially determined needs, perhaps brought about by globalization, perhaps brought about through interaction, have created this detour that it's difficult now for people to actually turn back from and come up with, again, not an architecture that is nostalgic, not cities that try and be like sort of, the Greek agora or the Roman forum, but actually something else that perhaps followed the logic of living with the earth and living with forces larger than of mankind's creation, that can somehow give resilience to our cities.
Right. One thing that we should pay attention is that we should not overdo it. In other words, we don't need to go from 0 to 100 overnight.
Quite right.
We have to do it slowly, and we have to bring people with us and communicate it, and at the same time explain and lead the way. But I'm very careful never to push too much, because if you push too much, you don't achieve anything. So especially in Pakistan has serious other problems. It's not only the sustainable city or not, as we know pretty well. So if we push for cities, probably like what I was explaining before, it's very hard to be adopted. But if we identify some elements and we push from there, then I believe that we are going to be heard. And we don't need to do everything at once. We have to think very carefully. We have to understand the culture, the climate, the needs, and the economic power as well. And we have to do things that they do not cost more money. And it is possible to do that.
I certainly hope that all of us in Pakistan follow this approach, because desperately needed over here to optimize on available resources, whether it's human capital or mineral or land. and also to wean ourselves off of crude oil and the consumption patterns that we currently have.
And more than that, if the leadership does not understand the concepts we discussed today, very soon Pakistan will not be able to support its population because of the growth of population. So sustainability is the only way to ensure that the country will be able to support its people. The problem is that this is not something that it's going to happen today or tomorrow. So we need people who make decisions, who have the vision of where the country needs to go, and also do small steps, very carefully selected, among all these things. You don't need to do everything at once.
Quite right. And on that note, I think, Dr. Pulalis, we can perhaps draw this session to a close. Would you like to add anything else that that we can learn from, perhaps?
Well, I would like to thank you very much again. What you're doing with LLF is amazing. I'm very proud to be associated. And
thank you for being a part of it.
And I hope to see you in person very soon in Lahore.
Absolutely, that will be great, Professor Pulalis. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.